Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is one United Nations division doing to assist indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, as well as older persons and the youth? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at a division within the Department for Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations that works with people who have disabilities, the youth, older persons, and many other groups. My guest today is an expert on this particular division and these issues. My guest today is Ms. Daniela Bas. Ms. Daniela Bas is the Director of the Department for Economic and Social Affairs Division for Social Policy and Development. Ms. Daniela Bas has specialized in international politics, human rights, and social development. Ms. Daniela Bas, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into these really important issue areas that I mentioned in the opening. Let's talk about DESA, the Department for Economic and Social Affairs. Just very briefly, what is it? What is its main function? What does it do generally?
This department that deals with the economy and the social affairs, of course, also embraces another dimension, which is the dimension dealing with the environment. It's a department that works in a very holistic manner, social, economy, and environment, so to give a better world to people. It's a very much people-centered department, and its aim is to promote development and in all its dimensions and cooperation at global level, and therefore provide a sound policy advice to governments so that then they can implement, would they wish to, those suggestions and advice at national level.
Mm-hmm. And now you head up the Division for Social Policy and Development. What exactly is, we're going to get into the individual units of that, but overall, what is the mission of that particular division?
Is to promote international cooperation, so to strengthen very important areas dealing with the reduction of poverty, promotion of employment and decent jobs, social inclusion, and of course reducing the gap of inequalities. For whom? Well, as you mentioned, for various groups of the world, social groups. And I'm talking about persons with disabilities, mm-hmm. older people, indigenous peoples, young people, and families as well. And it is also the focal point for the UN system when it comes to cooperatives, which are enterprises, but they think of profit in a different way. Cooperatives, like the United Nations, are people-centered as well.
Exactly. And all the groups you mentioned, everybody watching this show is probably a member of one of those groups, or we certainly know people who are, if we're not ourselves. So they touch our lives. These are people that we know, or we are one of the particular group. Well, let's talk. I pulled 6 different units off of your website, and let's just go through them briefly, and you give us a little update on what each does. The first is the Social Perspective on Development branch. What exactly does that branch do?
Well, as we know, the United Nations is an intergovernmental body. That means it's here to serve governments. And therefore, this specific branch researches, analyzes on the topics I just mentioned, that is these various groups of people, as well as what it is needed for in promoting social policies, that is social justice, for instance, but also decent work for everybody, and then we collect information on how the various 193 members of the United Nations, member states, have done throughout the year, but also what the United Nations agencies, funds, and programs have done in implementing the recommendations that have been adopted during the General Assembly when governments decide what their work plan is going to be for the next year. So we gather this information, we prepare therefore a report that then it is presented by the Secretary General to the members of this big organization, that is member states. And from there we decide if we have advanced in whatever we want to do in our work, if some areas in the world still need to be supported with either further additional advice or whatever it is needed, so that we properly serve this mechanism that is the United Nations. Think of an association. That's what I usually say. An association has members and has a charter. Those members who adhere to those principles, then they pay a fee, okay? And then they say, now we go home. This is the work plan for this year. But we're members, so we can decide what we want to do with this association. But we need somebody, though, who helps us to do this work. And therefore, here I am, a staff member of the United Nations, helping the members of this big association to achieve the results they want to achieve.
Exactly. And it sounds like you have a treasure trove of information on your website, and our viewers can go to UNDESADSPD.org, or they can just Google DESA and they will come up.
We also have a portal.
Yes, exactly.
It's the United Nations Social Development Network, UNSDN.org.
Okay, much shorter. Thank you so much. Well, let's talk about the next branch, the social integration branch. What exactly does it do?
The social integration branch deals with the integration of and inclusion and reducing the gap of inequalities of some specific groups that we are honored to host in my division within the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And these focal groups are representing youth, older persons, and family for the whole United Nations system. It's a big division, very complex division with a huge portfolio, and this branch deals specifically with youth, older people, and families.
Okay. And do you normally have conferences focusing on families, or you have perhaps a panel of experts who come in to talk about this? What can be done to help the youth, to help them to find employment, whatever the case might be? This youth unemployment is a major problem. There are many problems in the world, but that is one. So this is the purpose of that particular branch?
The purpose is to make sure that the World Plan of Actions on Youth and, for instance, are implemented. It's to make sure that we celebrate properly the International Days of Youth, International Day of Older People, International Day of Persons with Disability. We have lots of international days in my division are celebrated, and it's to create through gathering information and advice from top experts, is to prepare then publications, or, as you said, to assist major conferences in providing to member states and other stakeholders, because we want to work with other stakeholders as well, that is the civil society, the private sector, academia, trade unions, and so on and so forth, to raise awareness and share our knowledge and make sure that the norms and policies are implemented.
Exactly. And you mentioned older persons, and of course we're aging. You have, I think you have the sort of inverted pyramid where you have a large number of young people and a larger number of old people, or older persons, shall we say, and then you have a smaller group in the middle. What are some of the main issues or some of the major challenges to older persons today?
It varies so much, and the same applies to young people and the other groups I mentioned, depending on which part of the world we're focusing to. If it is the north part of the world, then the needs are different. Older persons there might maybe focus more on employment issues, on pension issues. If you think of older persons in other parts of the world, on the southern part of the world, and even there we have to make distinctions. Which part of the southern part of the world? Is it Asia? Is it Latin America? Where? Is it Africa? There again, the needs are different, and also the challenges are different. So we try to analyze and study these challenges and then address them depending on the country or the part of the region or continent we're dealing with. So it goes from health issues to integration, to employment, to care, to the role of older persons. In some communities, the role is very important because there are traditions and cultures that respect it very much. In other cultures, older persons, because there are so many stereotypes about how older persons are, which we know in many parts of the world now, a person who is 80 years old is very active. So we are also working on changing stereotypes and prejudices, because that will enable to change the behavior. By changing behavior, therefore, older persons will be not only perceived, but will really play a major active role in the society as an incredible resource.
Exactly.
For instance, and as you said, it's the pyramid. You mentioned the pyramid. So you were thinking about the demographical changes in the world. And indeed, this should be the pyramid that is down here, young people, and the older we get, unfortunately, the thinner the top of the pyramid is. Yes. And now what's happening in the world is that half of the world, if not more, is getting older, and another part of the world is younger and going to be even more young in the future couple of decades. I'm referring, for instance, to Africa and India. So the pyramid now, because of the world being somehow modifying its demographic distribution, is, as you said, becoming a little bit rounder. And all these young people we have today, and a population that is becoming older and older, in 20 or 30 years, these young people are going to be older themselves. So the pyramid might do this. So it's a phenomenon that we're studying very, very closely, and we are encouraging young people to be smart and think about their future as well.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned earlier inequities, inequality, that type of thing. Are we talking primarily about financial inequality? Are we talking about cultural segregation, discrimination? Do we go into areas like empowering women? How do you define that term, let's say, inequality?
Well, often people think of inequalities in economic and financial terms. But if we think of inequalities also in social terms, I was mentioning, for instance, health and education and employment and integration. So wherever there are barriers, cultural, political, or else, that impede people to enjoy equal rights, there we find inequality. And let's think, for instance, of persons with disabilities. Wherever you go, if there are stereotypes or other kind of barriers, physical barriers, that impede that person to reach the same place you would be able to because of the architectural barrier, for instance, that causes an inequality. But instead of having only stairs, you also have a ramp or an elevator, then here we are equal.
Exactly.
in spite being different.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs and also to perhaps make suggestions for future topics and future guests. Today we're taking a look at a division within the Department for Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations and the role it plays in working to help people who are older persons, people with disabilities, the youth, and a wide range of other folks too. My guest today is an expert on this division. My guest today is Ms. Daniela Bas. Ms. Bas is the director of the DESA Division for Social Policy and Development. Daniela, we're talking about these different demographic groups and different challenges they have. And I'm glad you brought up the persons with disabilities. This is another major unit within your operation. And you deal with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Basically, what is that convention and what are some of the provisions of it?
The convention has been adopted by the General Assembly in 2006, and it is the very first convention in the history of the United Nations, I would say, and the UN is 70 years old, as we know. So it's a major achievement that underlines the fact that persons with the disabilities are not subject, are active agents, and they are not objects or subject to the decisions of other people. Therefore, they have the right to enjoy whatever other people can, having access to education, employment, leisure, transports, communication, information, and all these are listed in the articles of the convention. And it talks about human rights, it talks about freedoms, and it talks about social development and the relevance and importance of social development to make sure that, as the Secretary General of the United Nations says, no one is left behind.
Exactly. And we have something like 7.2 billion people on planet Earth, and I've read and heard that we have nearly 1 billion people who have some type of disability, which is a large number of people, and everyone watching this program, perhaps some of the people who are watching have disabilities, but we certainly know people who have disabilities. We come into contact with them. Do you see that the stereotypes are changing? Years ago, so often societies, I won't try to identify all of them, but are within societies tried to shun many people with disabilities, maybe to warehouse them, to just ignore them and not provide services to them. But are we changing that opinion and coming to the conclusion that these people they really need to achieve their potential, but also they have a lot to contribute to society, and it's in the best interest of everyone. It's a human right to try to help them to achieve that potential. Is that stereotype breaking down to a large degree?
It is breaking down. I mean, it takes time, but it is breaking down. And as I said, it depends very much in which part of the world we are. Some countries have done and achieved lots of improvements, also in terms of having very strong social policy frameworks in place at national level. If you don't have strong social policy frameworks in place, it's very difficult to implement rights or human rights in this case. So that's why I say that development, human rights, and peace should walk hand in hand. And I'm mentioning peace now because the world presently is suffering of many conflicts. There are many conflicts around the world. Conflicts mean injured people. Injured people mean disabilities. More and more countries in the world use as means of transportation cars more and more. Cars often mean car accidents, disabilities. More and more the world, due to climate change, is suffering natural disasters. And natural disasters cause disabilities. So when we think about persons with disabilities, it is not them and us. That's the stereotype. It is a world that is changing, and therefore, though medicine on one hand can provide treatments and solutions, on the other hand, there are more and more people who, for one reason or another, become injured, some only temporarily, luckily, others in a more permanent manner. And disabilities in any case are not just those that can be seen. There are so many invisible disabilities. For instance, diabetes. It's invisible, but it is disabling. And more people in some parts of the world are becoming diabetic. So it's a huge, complex issue, and that's why I'm really suggesting to be wide enough to think of the world which is sustainable and accessible for all, for all. Particularly if we think also of a world where people are getting older and older, not necessarily becoming older implies to have a disability. But it often happens that by growing older, we also acquire some kind of disability. So I believe that the conference that we assist, where we discuss the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that by the way takes place in June, is a major platform where the various stakeholders, from governments to the civil society to academia, meet and discuss. And you know another thing, I'm very proud to say that when I came to the United Nations here in New York 4 years ago, I noticed that during the Forum of Indigenous Peoples that my division assists through the Secretariat that serves the Forum of Indigenous Peoples, there were no Indigenous peoples with disabilities. Well, in less than 3 years now, we have a caucus of Indigenous peoples with disabilities. And this year we had around 20-30 people, Indigenous peoples with disabilities attending. And more young people are also attending the various conferences that we serve as a division. Because we are really trying, or I am trying, together with the support of my staff and the leadership of the Undersecretary General of the department, to work in a very holistic manner and integrated manner, so that whenever we have a conference, if possible, it's very important to have an Indigenous person who might be older or might have a disability, and vice versa. And when it comes to Indigenous peoples, by the way, it is so important to preserve their traditions. Think of, we were talking about healing people, right? And healing nature and earth and Mother Earth. So the important role that Indigenous peoples can play, for instance, when it comes to climate change and the preservation of nature, because they remember and they know the old traditions of using herbs. And if you think of the pharmaceutical industry, the pills that they produce artificially, what are they if not an artificial reproduction of what we can find in nature? If we destroy nature, not only we damage Indigenous peoples' traditions and lives, but we really damage the life of the planet.
Exactly, it's very true. Well, we're down to about our last 2 minutes, but let me, if I could be a little more personal now. You, when you were very young, 6 years old, you had a tumor that pressed against your spine and it caused paralysis. What were some of the, obviously physical challenges, but just briefly, what were some of the cultural challenges that you had coming through that, if you can do that in 2 minutes? I know it's a hard task.
Well, in 20 days, I lost the use of my legs. It is as if I had a car accident, okay, more or less. I managed to survive because only very few people do. 2 or 3 children per 1 million have this very rare tumor. And all in a sudden, in those years, I became from Daniela, the handicapped. In those years, we were called the handicapped. I had and still have great parents. They decided to fight for me. They tried to give me all the tools that I needed to empower me through education and through physical rehabilitation, so that then later on I was able to empower myself. And the cultural prejudices I met were enormous. There are still many, but I am a stronger person now, and I think that I can also empower others now by leading by example. Yes. And if I have 30 seconds, the person who inspired me when I was 7 or 8 years old, I was attending primary school and we were studying history, international history, the history of the world. And I was looking at the page and it was mentioning somebody called Roosevelt, who was sitting on a wheelchair and had polio. And I was looking at that picture and I said, if that guy who lives very far from Italy made it, I could make it.
Exactly, exactly. And you have a very successful career, a normal life. You're a role model for people with disabilities. As you mentioned, it's not we versus them. It's not them versus us. It's we. We are all together, and there are long-term disabilities, there are short-term disabilities, but we need to learn much more about these. But Daniela Bas, these are very important issues that you're dealing with, the indigenous peoples, older persons, youth, just on across the board, and we certainly encourage our viewers to go to DESA.org and go to your particular website to check out more information on this. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.